Welcome to an episode of the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast, where we are going to dig into a study that looks all into if caffeine is something that you should be taking in after your training because it helps carb loading. Is that the gist, Sarah, of this study?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, cool. Well, we have Sarah Laverty here with us from TrainerRoad. It's a super interesting study. Kind of poses like I feel like somewhat of a paradox for a lot of athletes. If you're taking in caffeine after your training, before your training, maybe even taking it in during, that sounds kind of crazy. But anyways, super interesting study. Sarah, why don't we just jump right in? Break it down for us.
Yeah, so as Jonathan said, the goal of the study was to deplete the participants' glycogen stores and then see if consuming coffee with milk or comparing that to just consuming milk on its own had an effect on whether it improved our ability to restore glycogen levels or the participants. So the participants were cyclists and triathletes, all who trained at least 4 hours a week, with 1 year of experience in the sport. They were all pretty fit, so they had a VO2 max of an average around 59 milliliters per kilogram body weight, and an average peak power output of 346 watts. So
I'm going to put that in.
Oh yeah.
I'll put that in context really quick for people. Like the 59 for VO2 max, that's like going to be, that's a trained athlete. That's not somebody that is just an occasional rider. I know that we saw they trained at least 4 hours a week and they have 1 year of experience, but that's a fit person. If you're at 59, you'll see like if you're the sort of person, it's hard to generalize because it's individually variable. Some people do a whole lot more with less with VO2 max, right? Mark Cavendish is famous for having a really low, relatively speaking for world-class cyclists, low VO2 max. But if you, like, I think that during our tests that we've done here on the podcast, I think that Nate, when he was decently fit, was somewhere around 60, I think, maybe 63 or so. I could be wrong. Somewhere around there. And then, I was around 5 watts per kilogram. And at 5 watts per kilogram, I was, I think, right around 70. I might be just a bit below 70. So that gives you kind of like a point of reference. There are some people that have a VO2 max of like 59 and they're at 6 watts per kilogram. It does vary, but these are fit people. Also, peak power output too. That doesn't mean that their highest power they've ever put out is 346 watts. That's referenced all the time in studies, and it can get confusing because you read it and you're like, what?
Yeah.
But instead, PPO in this case is going to be, it's a sustainable amount of power that they can hold that's going to be at their VO2 max for a certain period of time. There's various different ways that PPO is defined, but suffice to say, these are fit people. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are these folks are not too dissimilar from you.
Yeah, exactly. Which is also relevant because our ability to store glycogen depends on our fitness and also our endurance training status, and then also like muscle size. So this information is hopefully applicable to TrainerRoad athletes for the most part.
Yes.
So the first glycogen depleting session, the first thing is that they got these baseline measurements from these athletes, and then they came in for basically with the intention of depleting their glycogen levels. So it involved a pretty grueling exercise session. So they had a 5-minute warm up, and then they rode at 90% of their peak power output for 2 minutes. And then there was a 50, and then they rode for 2 minutes at 50% of their peak power output, which is somewhat of a recovery, and then repeated that until they couldn't maintain 60 RPM anymore. But they didn't stop.
Putting this in context really quick. So 90% of peak power output is probably somewhere around like 105, 110% of their threshold, probably somewhere around there.
Yeah.
In terms of like their actual like threshold power for FTP, because that's like a bit more common for a lot of us. So thinking of that, you're doing like 2-minute lower end VO2 intervals, but then you have 2 minutes rest in between. And you do that until this 60 RPM for 15 seconds, everybody, if you've trained inside and you've been on a smart trainer before, you know that feeling when you're super exhausted and you're doing a workout that's too hard and it grinds you to a halt. That's what these people were doing. And then, like you said, they weren't done, right? Because they kept going after that.
Yeah. So they after they're already like getting to the point where they literally can't, like 60 RPM is not a high cadence. So they're struggling to turn the pedals. Then it just reduces to 80%. And they do this cycle again. So like they do this 80% for 2 minutes, 50% for 2 minutes, keep going until again they're like struggling to turn the pedals, and then they keep going, and then it repeats again to 70% and then 60%. So it's like a lot of these studies go to failure, but this is like is going beyond failure. It's like you fail 5 times before you get to end the test. So
And it makes sense because they're trying to deplete them, right? So like now, and it's crucial to point out that depletion, right, Sarah? It's not like you actually get to 0 glycogen left in the muscles. Our body doesn't do that. Like there's always a certain amount. We talked to Dr. Podlegar about this before just to get like a good reference of measurement and make sure that we checked our understanding. But really, like anywhere from like 600 to all the way up to like 1,000. And this is like a measurement of how much glycogen you have in your muscle in terms of dry weight, because glycogen is always stored with 1 part glycogen, 3 parts water. But when it's stored in your muscles, it was values around, and we'll get to the specific metrics in a bit, but it was values around like, if you're actually loaded up, you're going to be somewhere between 600. And if you're super well trained and you're used to taking in a ton of carbs and your body's on that train and working well, you might even be all the way up to like 1,000. And these people, the intent was to bring them down to like, was I right? Like somewhere around 100. So it's, you're by the end of the whole protocol.
Yeah.
This is the point. The point isn't productive training. The point is just
to
like turn on the taps and drain it all out.
Yeah. I mean, like for all of us who have ever bonked, it's a miserable feeling. So after this exercise protocol, they then were given a low carb meal, which consisted of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates, the same for protein, and then 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of fat. So for...
Not a lot of carbs there.
No, actually
not a lot of protein too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I put this into ChatGPT just to give to see what kind of meal that would give us, and it would be like so 48 grams. So say if you were 60 kilogram person, that's 48 grams of carbohydrate, 48 grams of protein, 60 grams of fat. And so that would be a grilled chicken salad with avocado dressing. So 170 grams of chicken breast, which is a typical chicken breast, 185 grams of cooked quinoa, some tomatoes and cucumber, and half an avocado with 2 tablespoons of olive oil. So your standard salad.
A lean salad.
Exactly. So then they came back the next morning after 10 to 12 hours of a fast. So they didn't eat in the morning when they came back. And they were given a second glycogen depleting session to guarantee maximum glycogen depletion, in the words of the researchers. So they during this test, they basically just cycled at 70% of peak power output until they couldn't go anymore. So yeah, even more miserable, given that they've not had anything since the last workout.
Oh, they're probably starved.
Yeah, exactly. And I just felt like nauseous and
I'd be really curious to see. I don't know if I saw this in this study, if they showed like how long some of the athletes went, because if you put that in context of like, let me see here, I have a little spreadsheet that kind of helps me get this figured out. But that's kind of riding right around somewhere around like sweet spot, like high sweet spot.
Right.
And some of these athletes, depending on their training status, they might have ridden for quite a while, like
Right.
at this until they got to the point where they were ground down to 60 RPM for 15 seconds.
Yeah.
So
You hope that they
really
were
tough.
like committing to the study as well, because at
Oh,
that
yeah.
point, yeah, the motivation would be dwindling, I'm sure.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I just want to give a quick plug. This podcast isn't sponsored by anybody except for our company, TrainerRoad, of course. And it's a lot of work that we all put in to make you faster, and it's something that we absolutely love to do. We're AI cycling software that makes you faster. You can be told exactly what to do every day and become a faster cyclist. It's super easy. The big problem is most cyclists don't train effectively, or they aren't training as effectively as they could. And what TrainerRoad does is it uses AI and science-based principles to give you the training you need to actually get faster. So if you haven't tried it yet, go to trainerroad.com, sign up. You can try it risk-free for 30 days. If we haven't made you faster in 30 days, we'll give you your money back. If you're a long-time listener to the podcast and you haven't tried it before, go ahead and try it now. It's a great time to do it. And if you have tried it and you do use it, will you please ask your friends to do so? That would be awesome for us. But with that out of the way, Sarah, let's keep going. So they've done this second glycogen depletion phase.
Yep.
They're really empty at this point. What happens next?
Yeah, so they have a muscle biopsy done on them. So the researchers literally withdraw a portion of their muscle to measure glycogen levels and an enzyme called glycogen synthase. And glycogen synthase is an enzyme that helps restore glycogen levels and is more active when we're glycogen depleted. So they're getting those levels. Yeah.
I had to research this to understand it, and then I had to like do the tell me like I'm 5 sort of a version here
Right.
to understand. But and let me know in the comments if I'm missing this up, especially if they're researchers listening to this, they can correct me. Sarah, maybe you can correct me. But effectively, from what I understand, the way that glycogen synthase works, it's an enzyme, like you said, and what it does is it takes glucose and it then takes that glucose and says, hey, get over into the muscle. And you need to stay there because that's where I'm going to use you for future activity, whatever that might be. So it's a transporter in terms of functionally, it transports things over, and that's how this enzyme works. So, we take in carbohydrates, then, we have blood sugar that gets added into our blood. And as a result of consuming that, and then this says, hey, get over there into the muscle. That's where you need to be. So then we can do things in the future. So that makes sense why they were measuring this, if we're really trying to see if caffeine helps you carb load like this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. So yeah, and then they also measured blood glucose and insulin levels. Then the recovery, so that's at the beginning of a 4-hour recovery period. And
They still
during,
can't eat.
yeah, they've not eaten yet. Yeah,
They're
exactly.
probably so hungry.
We're prodding at their muscles. They're like, we
Oh.
just want food.
Yeah, they're so they're huge needles. They have to take a chunk out of your muscle. It's a tube, less of a needle and more of a tube.
Have you had it done, Jonathan?
No, people
Okay.
on the podcast have always said that we need to, and Nate has always said, yeah, it's not bad. And then I've talked to researchers and they're like, oh yeah, it's really painful.
Yeah.
It's a giant tube. Have you had it done before, Sarah?
No, but in the paper, I think they said something about the participants had to agree to not exercising the day after or a couple of days after or something like that. So I was like, oh damn, this must be pretty intense.
Yeah, they have to. I mean, it's a tube that goes into your muscle, and it basically just punches a hole in that muscle, and it takes whatever that punch is back up. So then they have the little muscle tissue that they can analyze. So it's quite literally tearing the muscle. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, per participants. Okay, so finally they get their recovery drink, which they're given 3 drinks. And so there was 2 conditions, and all participants completed both conditions in a randomized order. So in one condition, they were given coffee with milk and some sucrose. And then in the other condition, they were just given milk and sucrose. So the difference being they were given some coffee with some caffeine in it, obviously. So that was given at 0 minutes, so straight after the muscle biopsy, at 60 minutes, and then at 120 minutes. The drink was like and they were also actually given a meal only at
Mm.
120 minutes. So they finally get some real food at 2 hours after this last exercise session. And each of the meal and the drinks, they all provided carbohydrates and protein at a ratio of 4-1, and being 1.2 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight and 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So again, if we're putting that into context, if you were a 60 kilogram person, that means you'd be getting 72 grams of carbohydrates and 18 grams of protein in these recovery drinks. And
So it's not a Thanksgiving dinner.
no, by no stretch
It's
of the
still nothing
imagination.
big.
Yeah, exactly. Over the course of 4 hours, they were given 8 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine. So to put that into context,
Whoa, that's not a small amount.
yeah, I think for a 60 kilogram person, that would be 7.6 shots of coffee over. I would be flying to the moon at that point. It would not be pretty. But if you're, a 100 kilogram person, that's almost 13 shots of coffee. So
Whoa.
it's a lot. Yeah.
800 milligrams of caffeine if you're a 100
Right.
kilogram person. If you're an 80 kilogram person, 640 milligrams. If you're a 60 kilogram person, 480 milligrams. So those are stiff pours there. That's
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And they also had blood samples drawn 6 times over 4 hours. So they were measuring blood glucose and insulin throughout the recovery period. So finally, at the end of that 4 hours, they were another muscle biopsy. Yeah, because it's not enough. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they were get another muscle biopsy to get that final glycogen level and to see what the glycogen synthase was up to at that point. So what did they find? The muscle glycogen, unsurprisingly, was successfully depleted at the end of that second exercise session. After the recovery period, so 4 hours later, after consuming, first of all, the milk and coffee, their glycogen increased by 102 millimoles per kilogram of dry weight. To compare that then to when they consume just the milk and the sucrose alone, their glycogen increased by 40 millimoles per kilogram of dry weight. So a difference there.
Significant difference.
Yeah. But as Jonathan said, our full storage capacity that falls quite short of our full storage capacity for glycogen. So it's by no means fully recovered. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well when we're looking at the glycogen synthase activity, which in the group that consumed milk and coffee, that decreased by a lot, by a lot more basically than it decreased in the milk group. So basically, it almost was that in the coffee group, they had recovered their glycogen to a level that the glycogen synthase activity was like, I'm no longer needed. And so that works, that operates in a negative feedback loop. So the more glycogen you have, then the glycogen synthase will decrease and it isn't needed to quickly restore the glycogen. Whereas in the milk group, the decrease was much less significant than when they were consuming coffee. So I think when we're looking at that on in a practical way, it would be interesting to know whether, like, if we extended the duration of the study to say 8 hours, it would be interesting to know at what point does the milk group then catch up because of that reduced glycogen synthase, or because of the reduced glycogen synthase activity in the coffee group. And where do we see that those two meet each other?
I'm going to break this down like I'm 5 again, if that works.
Please do.
So basically, you have all these resources on one side of a river, and then you need to get them to the other side of the river, right? So like on the empty side of the river, that's your muscles after this horrendous glycogen depletions process. And then suddenly you've got food that shows up like a supply drop on the other side of the river, right? And then your glycogen synthase is the only one that can cross the river and bring it back over. And they're like, we have a critical need over here. So a lot of glycogen synthase gets to work. But once there's enough supplies on the other side of the river, they're like, okay, we don't need that much, glycogen synthase. We just need a couple of you now. Like, it's chill. Mm-hmm. We got everything over. It's a bit more balanced now. And what it sounds like from this is that, like, initially, when you take in caffeine, it like really sounds the alarm and gets a lot of glycogen synthase activity going on. And more so than if you just take in carbohydrates like they did through carbohydrates and protein, I should say, just like when they drank milk. It's more of like, these are probably wrong assumptions with the curve, but it's kind of like a progressive curve, or dare I say like exponential in the beginning, where it's very steep, a steep ramp up when you take in caffeine of that glycogen synthase activity, and then it levels off. Whereas if you don't have that caffeine, it might be a little bit more of a linear one. And effectively what it seems like, Sarah, is they do eventually meet at the same place. It's just the caffeine seems to make it happen sooner. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe an assumption, or maybe, that's not what this study says. But
okay,
that
cool.
would be, there is a debate within, like we've seen this when we're looking into other studies, this debate about a recovery window post-exercise. And I think this study is in support of the idea that if we need to replenish our glycogen stores really quickly, then that recovery window is important, and things like caffeine or being strategic about what we do to replenish those quickly is helpful. But if time is not of the essence, and if we're not necessarily needing full glycogen stores within 4, 6, 8 hours, I'm not sure what that time frame exactly is, then the caffeine might not be as critical. It might not be a crucial component to optimal recovery.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I guess, and I don't want to get into like sort of like the discussion level stuff. We can get into that in a bit. So I won't jump ahead anymore. Sarah, sorry.
No, I think we're almost there. Yeah. So I think,
okay, cool.
like, if we look at, we've said, the glycogen synthase that that activity was different between the two groups. And so we're just thinking about, like, what does this mean then for TrainerRoad athletes? And I think a question, as I mentioned, is like, how quickly do we need to restore glycogen levels? So if you're maybe you're a triathlete and you have double days, you have a session in the morning and a session in the evening, and you're even like you're struggling to fit meals in, and it's there's some practical challenges there. Then consuming caffeine with your carbohydrates might give you an advantage then going into your second session.
Triathletes, it sounds like, in particular,
right,
or those that are doing multi-sport in one way or another, and you're doing 2 different workouts in one day. I guess you could also say like the whole double threshold trend, particularly in running, that's very common. Can I just breaking down double threshold really quick?
Yeah.
I'm seeing more and more people reference it in cycling, and I truly think that that's a bit of a maybe an incorrect prescription, like to bring it over to cycling. Maybe unless you're like Tadej Pogacar or something. But for most of us, like the challenge with running is that you can't accumulate actually like a significant well, most people can, but then when you're Jakob Ingebrigtsen, that's a bit different, right? But like most people, what you can do for threshold, like time at threshold intensity in a specific session, like that's enough to cook you for the day. But then with the world's best athletes, they're unique. They're very special. They can do even more. They have lives arranged around their training. So they get to the point where they actually need more than, because in an hour, if you can do more than 30 minutes or 40 minutes at threshold, like it's probably not going to, and when you're running, it's probably not getting to the point where it's like your actual threshold. You might actually have to increase that pace a bit. So that's why, and these athletes they can do even more than that. Whereas in cycling, like you can do more time at your threshold in a single session than what you can do in running. And also it helps you avoid injury as well with running by, instead of trying to do 2 hours at threshold over like a 3-hour run, which would be a huge training session for a runner. That would just be massive. Yeah. That would risk injury because of the nature of running. Whereas with cycling, you actually might be able to piece something like that together in an interval workout. Boy, it would be tough. But it's probably not going to injure you.
Right.
Fatigue you? Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of why they separate those in the running world, and they split it into different days or different sessions in a single day. But in the cycling side of things, there's not a whole lot of evidence to back it up that people are hitting a point of diminishing returns because they just can't accumulate enough time at threshold in a single session. In most cases, that's going to be enough that your body's like, I need some time to recover from this. Like, give me time until tomorrow. So, but I do think that this is a good example of maybe if you're doing that or you're doing multi-sport, or maybe you're doing something like you're doing your strength training and then you're doing cycling thereafter. That could be the case. Did the study, I didn't catch this really, there were some discussions, I'm looking right now. They're talking about this effect of glycogen synthase, and this is in the discussion portion. It says, it's basically saying, therefore, we cannot state a cause and effect relationship between coffee consumption and the reduction in glycogen synthase activity. Rather, the effect of coffee is more likely to have been due to an early increase in enzyme activity. Kind of that, like what we talked about, taking that coffee, and it ramps that up earlier than it would be otherwise. They say similar findings were reported by Bottram et al. In 2004, who investigated the effects of caffeine intake on glycogen resynthesis in healthy men after glycogen depleting exercise. The authors reported that caffeine intake was associated with a significant decrease in glycogen synthase activity. And in your mind, you're kind of like, that doesn't make sense. That's like the opposite of what we saw in this study, right? But this was at the end of a 5-hour recovery period. Whereas since this one, they were taking the measurements all along the way and they took it earlier, they actually saw that it actually spikes it more than you'd think early on.
Right.
And then as a result, since it spiked it, it isn't needed later on.
Yeah.
And that's why it shows up as kind of being later. So did they discuss any sort of like time frame where they feel like if you have 5 hours in between your training session, it doesn't matter? And it's not going to be beneficial?
No, they didn't. But kind of in the inverse of that was that they said that if you're training within 4 hours, then this would be beneficial. They didn't say at what point it wouldn't become beneficial, but I think that's because we need to see the duration of the study to be longer to know exactly at what point those two meet and coffee is no longer an advantage.
Yeah. This is, practically speaking, this could be really tough for athletes too, right, Sarah? Because if you are an athlete that, like, let's just say, because there's one side of things that's like, okay, I don't have a training session later, but I do have life to take care of. And I don't want to be like dragging for 4 hours after my workout. It's tough to sometimes get in sufficient amount of food and everything else that comes in after that. It's also be really interesting to see this carried out in a different way where they give people a more substantial meal with more carbohydrate and to see how that changes. That would be really interesting. But anyways, with that in mind, life is hard. And if you're training and you're depleted and then you're going into something, this might be for the early morning exerciser. This might be a very good reason for you to have a coffee or take in caffeine in one form or another post exercise. So then that way you might just be, if you finish your training at 7 a.m. and you have a 9 a.m. meeting, you might just be maybe a bit more sharp and prepared for that meeting. I don't know.
Right.
But for evening exercisers, I would not touch this. Like, because while you may be making it so that you can take in, or you can replenish glycogen stores more rapidly, you're going to sleep all night. So chances are you can take care of that. And if you drink that coffee, you're probably not going to sleep all night. It's going to be tough. And it's going to be disturbed sleep. So maybe those are, I don't know. Have you thought of any other like practical recommendations about how to apply this information?
Yeah, I think my only thought, I think it's got a very specific use case. Like, I think, because even if we think about the effects of like drinking this much coffee over the course of 4 hours, is not.
That's a good point too. It's a lot of coffee.
Yeah, and for like most people, I don't think that actually feels very good, and that can have then detrimental effects on concentration and anxiety and all the rest of that. But also, it's not. So if we think about also an interest, like coming back to the results a little bit. Sorry, we're kind of jumping around here, but the insulin and glucose or glycemic response to this much caffeine, there was a greater insulin and a greater glycemic response to the in the caffeine group, meaning that their blood glucose was increased and their insulin response then was as well. And if we think about why that is, that's adrenaline, or it's from the effect of adrenaline, and that's like a fight or flight mechanism. That's not rest and recover, So if we think about like recovery or as more holistically, is it's not just about restoring glycogen immediately.
That's a good point.
It's not putting our body in this rest and recovery state, and where we might want our sympathetic nervous system to be down-regulated as opposed to jacked up.
Yeah. And I know morning trainers are probably thinking of this and they're just like, I don't have any time to rest and digest after I train in the morning. Like, it's just life is on and it's go, go, go.
Yeah.
And you probably already are in that similar scenario. This is really interesting. I haven't thought of caffeine helping on the backside of workouts like this. I've always thought of it pre and then per, like, during, but I've never thought of it post.
Yeah.
This is a super interesting study. Who are the authors again on this one, Sarah? Let me look up here.
That's a great question. Let me just pull up the study.
Lais Montero Rodriguez. Oh, Lorero. His name is super. I've seen his research all over the place. Lorero. Loureiro.
Yes. Yeah.
And all the colleagues involved in this one.
Yeah.
From a university in Brazil. It looks like Universidade de Brasilia in Brazil. So, super cool study. Super interesting. Thanks for breaking it down for us, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, you feel like now you have something that you can test to make you faster. Maybe you have something that you know that you don't have to use to try to get those marginal gains. You can let us know down in the comments below, but also by signing up for TrainerRoad. Again, most cyclists don't train as effectively as they could be, and TrainerRoad makes sure that you get that training that you need to get faster. So go try it. It's AI cycling software for cyclists that works. Be told exactly what you need to do every day to get faster. Do it at trainerroad.com, share it with your friends, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, everybody. Take care.